All right, today's lecture is going to be based on the individualized education program. We've clearly been talking about special education in general, but then getting more into the specifics of special education. And last week we talked about the ETR, which determines if a student has a disability. And if you recall, when it is determined that a student has a disability, in order to meet the FAPE requirement of IDEA, the education must be appropriate for the student, and it is this document, the IEP, that makes sure that the student is receiving an appropriate education for them. And just as a review, the first step in identifying a child with a disability is pre-referral intervention, which in most schools now is RTI, or response to intervention. And this is where the general education teacher is using evidence-based practices in their classroom to make sure all students are receiving high-quality instruction. It also includes making sure that students who are struggling are getting varying levels of interventions that are not part of special education. Right? And then if the student continues to struggle in that step, then they move on to the formal evaluation, which is run by the school psychologist. And that is the creation of that very large document that we looked at last week called the Evaluation Team Report, or the ETR. And then we then are moving on to creating that IEP in a timely manner. So just to talk about the general components, you'll see here there are 12 general components, and we'll go through each of these just very briefly. This is meant to be a brief introduction to the IEP. Getting into the specifics of the IEP can be very, very overwhelming, and so we like to save that fun for the intervention specialist majors. But on the other hand, you will, as a general education teacher, work with IEPs, you'll work with kids with disabilities, you'll contribute to the IEP process. Therefore, it's very important that you also understand what this document is and what can be found in the document. All right, so the first part of the IEP is future planning, and this is all about linking students to adult success. Remember, we talked about the big ideas in special education, and one of those is adult success. So no matter what age you are teaching, the skills you're giving your students, the knowledge you're giving your students, is so that they can be successful adults, even if that's a very long-term goal for early childhood. Still, everything we're giving the students is about being a successful adult. So that first section is about where do you see the students, what are the skills you want to give the students in order to help them be successful. This is usually based on a discussion with the child and the parents. So as the teacher, you do take the back seat to the future of the student. It's the parents that will tell you what their goals are for their child, especially the younger they are. And this should be based on what you see in the ETR. And it's difficult. We can start to discuss this in class further, but making sure that what's in the ETR and what the child's abilities are linked to what goes into future planning. So if in the ETR you never see any mention of the student playing sports or being involved in athletics in any way, and their future plan cannot be playing in the NFL, right? So those two things don't match up. If you have a child who has a very, very low IQ, who has continued to show low test scores, low IQ, over many years, being a physician may not be an appropriate future plan for that student. So that's what I mean by linked to the ETR. So when you discuss these elements, where does the parent see the student? It's typically things like getting a job after graduation, going on to a 4-year college, going on to a 2-year training program, anything along those lines. Those are the types of things that you would see here. It could also be for the younger students, wanting the child to enjoy school, wanting the student to be successful in school, wanting them to learn how to read fluently. I mean, those are things that are very important to future plans. And so once you've decided what goes in this particular area, then you discuss the available services. So once the parents say this is where we see the child, or the child says this is where I want to be, then you start to discuss, okay, how are we going to get you to that point? And then the IEP then should reflect what's in the future planning stages. Section 3 is what we refer to as the big picture. So if you're going to be a general educator, this is probably one of the first things you'll take a look at. It's a paragraph 4, 5, 6 paragraphs, depending on the student, how long they've had an IEP, how well you know the child. You'll get to know everything about them. So strengths and weaknesses, things that they like so that you can develop rapport with them, their current academic performance, so their current grades, current attendance records, if that's of concern. In here you talk about what has worked for the student. So does it work for them to be seated up front? Does it work for them to have small group testing? Does it work for them to work with a high-functioning peer, to do some peer tutoring? So anything that has shown to be successful for the student, you want to make sure that's there. That just helps you as a general education teacher. If you're reading that, you say, okay, this has worked, then that's something I can do in my classroom. Any social behavioral abilities, if the student struggles socially, if they have behavioral struggles, you'll want to note that here. Any relevant background information, maybe the child's new to the school, maybe the child is in their 3rd school in 2 months. Those are things to note here as basic background information. And I mentioned this earlier, but student interests, so whatever they're interested in, it helps everyone to make a personal connection to the student if you know this information. And anything as far as relevant medical and health information. So nothing major do you want to disclose here, but things like needs glasses, wears contacts, peanut allergies, very important things like that, or things that will affect the student's academic performance. You'd want to put those here. All right. And the next section is the transition. So 4 and 5 both refer to transition. And what transition means, you'll hear this term a lot. So transition, when you hear about it, as it refers to education, it generally means transitioning from being in high school to life after high school. However, most of what you're doing, I've talked about this before with adult success, is moving students to be successful in this transition. However, sections 4 and 5 are for older students. So you'll see when you look at the IEP that you'll have, as noted in the last 2 bullet points here, that there's a statement needed by the age of 14, and then the assessments are needed by the age of 16. Right? So these become really important in middle school and high school. These sections will usually be blank until that point. Right? This is directed towards where the student wants to be after high school. So this is where you would put specifically wants to attend a 4-year university, wants to attend a 2-year training program, wants to take classes but attain a full-time position, working. So you'll want to make sure that you're very aware of what the plan is at an early age, so 14-ish, so that you can make sure the high school years are really helping the student fine-tune the skills they need to be successful in that placement. Right. And then section 5 is, once you determine what goes in section 4, section 5 is where you put the goals and objectives to help the student reach that goal. Right. So this can be things like what I've most often seen, students who want to attain a full-time job after graduation. This will be things like job training. It could be entering the career center, and at the younger age, maybe it's just your goal will apply and be accepted to the career center. That would be a goal that you would see here if the post-secondary goal is related to getting a full-time position or possibly going on to a 2-year training program. For students with more significant disabilities, you would see things here as far as independent living. So if it's possible that the child will be able to graduate and go on to live in an apartment or to live by themselves, then you want to put things here like we'll learn how to do laundry, we'll learn how to balance a bank account, we'll open a bank account. Right? So whatever goes here, they're very measurable, very attainable, very specific goals about what the student will be able to do to help them meet that large transition goal. Right. In section 6, we're going to practice this next week. These are the measurable annual goals, and this is where you will spend most of your time. We had talked about in the ETR towards the end, the school psychologist will condense, what are the most important areas of weakness for the student. So any of those areas of weakness, they then need to become goals or objectives, which is what we're looking at now. So if you know a student is struggling with reading fluency, then you must have an annual goal related to reading fluency. If there's something related to specific math calculations they struggle with, then you need an annual goal that talks about math calculations. Right? These are the goals that will guide your instruction, especially as a special education teacher. You have to teach them these skills, even though in their content area, math class, they may not be learning these skills. Maybe they're learning much higher level thinking skills, math skills, but your goal is to make sure you're catching them up, which is why these goals will truly reflect what you're doing as a teacher. You work towards making sure they're meeting these goals. You have to be able to collect data on each of these objectives regularly or as often as possible. Those of you who are going to be general education teachers, you should be given this information. If you're teaching math, then you'll want to take a look at what goals they have related to math. Not only does it tell you where their areas of weakness are, it tells you the things that you can do in class to help them meet these goals also. When looking at the annual goals page, you'll see it asks you to identify a clear area that each goal will cover. So it can be basic things like math, science, social studies, written expression, which is writing skills or spelling. It can say things like language arts, reading, but also it can have things like organization, transition skills, independent living, right? Those can be types of goals too. So it doesn't just have to be a content area. It's whatever the child is weak in. And then right below that, for each goal that you have, you'll determine the present levels of academic achievement. This is also known as PLOP, P-L-O-P. And what goes here is just what the current baseline information of where the student is in this area. So if the area for this goal is math, then you will put in the present levels area what grades they're receiving in math, what particular weaknesses they have, typical errors that they make, whether or not they attend class regularly, do they complete homework regularly. You can compare homework scores versus quiz scores versus test scores here. So in that particular area, it's most important that you're providing solid quantitative data regarding where the student is. So you'll have a large goal, an annual goal, meaning what the child will achieve in 1 year's time. But then below that, you can have measurable objectives. So if the goal is a large goal, you may be able to break that down. So maybe you can't just focus on that goal all year, but you're going to break it down and focus on small prerequisite skills to get the child to that larger goal. And we'll look at that more next week. Another part of the IEP is it talks about modifications and accommodations. And so a lot of people get these confused. Sometimes they confuse them with the other one, but sometimes they're lumped into one category. And most often, I see accommodations. Modifications are pretty rare. So if you just look at the word modifications, it has modify in it, which means changing, right? Which in this case, it means changing the task. So giving a student a paper to write, maybe they struggle with writing, so a modification would be instead of writing a paper, you can do an oral presentation. Right, so rarely do we see those things because usually when a paper is being written, it's because of a language arts goal or because of specific writing goals. So making sure the student can, modifying that for them to be able to orally present does not get at what the actual task is asking or what the teacher hopes to measure. So we don't see modifications very often, especially within mild to moderate. What you will most often see are accommodations, such as extended time on larger assignments, on quizzes, on tests. You could have small group testing where students are able to take their test to another room to work on it. You may have taking a large task and breaking it into manageable tasks. All right, so those are the more common things that you're going to see. Rarely will you see a true modification. What you will be largely working with are accommodations. And it's important to know when you have a child in your class with an IEP, no matter what your license is in, what is an accommodation, so it's listed in that IEP, you have to legally provide the student. So you should never have someone come in, as someone supervisory, come into your room and say, okay, I know you have this child with an IEP in your class, what are his or her accommodations? And you not be able to say what they are. You have to be aware of them, and you have to be providing it to them. That's where schools and teachers are getting in trouble. They're not following the IEP, meaning they don't know the accommodations, therefore they're not even providing it for them. The older a student is, they should be able to advocate for themselves and say, these are the accommodations I get, this is how I want to take advantage of them. That's something they should be doing as they get older. However, it's not required that they do that. The younger they are, though, you are very much responsible for implementing those accommodations. Another reason why these are very important is because of district-wide, statewide testing. So any accommodations that are on the IEP for students to utilize throughout the school year in their classes will also be provided on statewide, district-wide testing. Right? So it becomes kind of a contentious issue sometimes because parents want to make sure that their children will have access to small group or extended time if possible, especially for the testing. Right. And so we know that students, one big part of when you have all of the goals created for the student is determining where they're going to be educated. What setting will they be in? So you should let these goals and objectives guide you in that decision. If the student can meet those goals and work towards those goals in a general education classroom, that's where they should be. Right? If that's not possible, then the next thing you would consider is having them in an inclusion setting or co-teaching setting where they're in general education but with an intervention specialist present. If that's not possible, then you can consider what we think of as a resource room where it's just for kids with IEPs. Right? And if that's not possible, then you move back. So the important part of this is that you want to make sure students are as close to a gen ed classroom as possible. That's wherever they can do that and be successful, that's their least restrictive environment. So you always have to be considering where the student needs to be and where they can make progress towards those goals. It's also possible to change that. So if in your initial IEP meeting you think, hey, I think that this can be accomplished in an inclusion setting, but you're collecting data and the data is showing you they're not successful, you can always move that. You can always change that and say, okay, a resource room is better. You hold what's called an IEP addendum meeting. They're pretty quick. And you bring your IEP team together and you say, we'd just like to change this one part, discuss it. If everyone's in agreement, you sign off, and then you make it happen the very next day. Right? So anything on the IEP can be amended with a meeting and proper signatures and proper attendance for that meeting. So just know that it can always be changed. All right, and this is the continuum of placements. So these are all the possibilities for a child with a disability. When you hear least restrictive environment, you should never think inclusion because that's just one possible environment for that student. Right? And you can see how it moves from the severity of the disabilities, number of students. So at the very bottom, that's regular classroom. So that's as close as you can possibly get to being in general education, and then it moves back. So it's possible that a student who with significant disabilities, their least restrictive environment, their closest that they can be to general education is at the very top, the homebound or hospital. It's absolutely possible. So that's why it's important to not think of the name of the disability, but to know the child. How close can they get to that bottom part of this slide and still be successful? Right? So we know this because we've talked about common characteristics that disability doesn't determine the placement. This is very important because you'll often hear the student has a behavioral disorder, therefore they're going to be in the behavioral unit. Not true. Not at all true. It's possible that that's their least restrictive environment, but you know that just having that disability label doesn't tell you anything. You have to know the student and where they can be most successful. In fact, I have found that in my experience, students with behavioral disorders, they do very well in a general education classroom because they're around peers that do not have behavioral issues. So they have this pressure to not stick out. So they tend to behave better. And then when they get into their behavioral unit, then they let go. And that's when you see a lot of behaviors. But I think it's very important to know that just because in the behavioral unit you may be seeing these behaviors doesn't mean that out in general education they wouldn't be able to keep it together, because they very often they do. Right. So by law, we've already talked about this, but just as general review, these 5 people must be present at the IEP meeting by law. The intervention specialist who runs the meeting, who does most of the IEP writing, who will do the communication with all of the people attending to set up the meeting date and time. The school psychologist or someone to interpret the test results. So the school psychologist will come to talk about that aspect. A general education teacher will always have to be there. It may be that you don't have the student in class, and that's okay because you're the content expert. So you're there to look at the objectives that are written to make sure they're aligned with where the students without disabilities are. And then an administrator should always be present, and then the parent. And we talked about how the parent needs to be invited multiple times and how to document that, but it's okay if you have all of that in order to hold the IEP meeting without them if you've made every attempt to get them there and you've been able to document that. These other people can be present. The child can be present if they're old enough, if it's effective, if it's something that will make sense for the child to be present. A parent advocate, possibly an attorney, and anyone the parent wants to bring can be there. All related services professionals, so the speech-language therapist should be there if the child's receiving speech-language services, and then a physician if needed, if the parent decides to bring the physician. So as the teachers, you guys will not have the power to bring in anybody you want. If anyone is going to be there that you want there, you have to okay it with the parent, whereas the parent can bring anyone that they want. It'd be ideal for them to ask, but they don't have to ask. All right, so that's just a brief overview of the IEP. And like I said, next week we'll get into writing and what a legal IEP objective should look like, and we'll get into writing that. And so I want you to answer the questions on the IEP exploration questions. They're on the guided notes if you have those in front of you. And I'm going to include them on the next slide if you want to pause it there to write them down. But I'm asking you to answer those questions based on the IEP that I have provided for you. It's based on the same student from the ETR we looked at last week. So I want you to make sure you open that. You don't have to print it, but you can open it. That's where you'll be able to answer the questions. And make sure you put that in the Dropbox on Panther Learn by Sunday evening. These are the questions. If you don't have the guided notes, you can pause it here. These are the questions that you'll need to answer. And then just a general reminder, by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. you should complete the IEP quiz, which is based on what we just talked about, the guided notes too, the EBD cheat sheet, and also the IEP exploration questions that I just showed you on the last slide. All right, thanks for your understanding.